The paper I chose to present is titled Engendering Racial Perceptions, an intersectional analysis of how social status shapes race. It is authored by Andrew Penner and Alia Saperstein and was published in the journal Gender and Society in June of 2013. There's a PDF link available on the first slide for those who are interested in the full document. So, a brief summary of this study. In the study, the authors took a large data set from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, which is conducted by the Department of Labor, and analyzed that data set for changes in the perception of race of individuals under varying conditions. The results show that certain social status markers are significantly correlated with classification of race by an interviewer. For example, the social status marker of ever being below the poverty line stereotypically correlates with being classified as black. Or the social status marker of being married with children correlates with being classified as white. So this is a reference to how class, being the social status markers, interacts with the classification of or the interpretation of an individual's race by an interviewer. Additionally, these social status markers are at times different for men versus women. So, if you take the social status marker of ever receiving welfare, that is different between men and women in terms of how they're classified racially in for both being classified as white or being classified as black. The conclusion from these results is that misclassification is connected to discrimination and that discrimination is intersectional for some status markers, meaning that class, race, and gender all contribute to differing responses based on different social status markers. So, why would a librarian be interested in a Gender and Society article? Well, data science can take insights from case studies or anecdotes and build quantitative experiments that study the validity of those insights, meaning that we hear often of people describe themselves as being discriminated against, but it's hard to demonstrate quantitatively that that phenomenon is happening consistently. So this study does a good job of finding a data set that allows for an interpretation of markers that may cause discrimination and then presenting changes in race interpretation. So 6% of the individuals classified as a different race from year to year, and in the entire sample frame, 20% of the respondents experienced at least one change in their classification of what race they are. So typically, people assume that race is sort of a fixed outcome, and this study does a good job of showing that it's based on the way we see how someone fits into a specific box. So the assumption here is that within these markers, there are misclassifications of race based on the impact of the interviewer receiving that marker. And so, librarians who are interested in the protection of patron privacy would also be interested in this effect of social data on the perception of race between different genders. So, the paper contributes to the notion that with added context comes added opportunity for bias, meaning that if you give someone data about someone they're going to meet or going to make decisions about, for example, these social status markers, they may make them more inclined to discriminate against that individual depending on the context of those social status markers. And a constant examination of one's own perception of status helps to break down the categorization that leads to bias and discrimination. So it's important for any individual to look at how discrimination works or class or categorization of individuals works to break down their own biases. The author's motivation is that quantitative studies on inequality typically measure aspects independently and determine which aspect is most prominent, as opposed to this study, which specifically attempts to look at effects that are changed by the addition of gender. So you're looking at class determining race and whether the class determines race is different for different genders. Additionally, they want to give context to stereotypes that allows for clearer understanding of the barriers that keep them in place. For example, the outcome of the study demonstrates that the more social status markers an individual has, the more likely they are to be discriminated against. And that goes back to the privacy point that I was just talking about, where if we allow personal data to get out, it makes or it can make a situation in which an individual is more likely to be discriminated against unfairly. They also want to identify specific markers that people use to racially categorize people and how they manifest across gender. So by knowing the specifics, it's easier to mitigate them, basically, to look at what kind of data is going to lead to individuals being discriminated against. So here's a data set from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. It begins in 1979. You can see from this that there's a significant amount of different factors that they're measuring. And the way the study works is basically that they take 12,686, as you can see on the bottom right here, unique individuals, and then basically interview them every year for 20 years. And then the data set that these authors of this study are studying is the change between 1 year for each individual. So that's how you get this N of 182,224, since an individual is going to have a sample unit that's taken from 1 year to the next year. So that's the treatment, a year's time. And then these are the types of variables that they test for. So there's kind of three different classifications here. So there's racial classification by the interviewer, which is white, black, or other. And then there's respondent characteristics. So these are like the social status markers that are self-reported for the most part by the individual in the interview. And then there's the characteristics of the interviewers, which is a control. And also some of these characteristics are controls. But you can see how they correlate pretty obviously with established stereotype markers. So percentage of people incarcerated, percentage of people living below the poverty line, percentage receiving welfare, and then you can see the kind of similar but opposite where married with children, living in a suburb, years of education, and so that's most of the variables that are going to be presented here. There are a few additional controls that I'll show as well. But the important part is that the dependent variables are the interviewer's classifications of the respondent's race, and the independent variables are the repeated measures of the respondent's social position. Okay, so in the first data that they provide the reader, they demonstrate the likelihood that there is a gender difference that an individual is misclassified by the viewer. So if individuals were never misclassified, you would see this table diagonally go 100%. And you can see that and this is between two consecutive interviews. So you can see that here it's measuring for women. If you're previously classified as white, what is the likelihood that you'll be classified as white in the next year's interview? And you can see there's some errors here. So 0.5%, 294 individuals classified as Black, and then 3.7%, 2,040 individuals were classified as other. And you can see, and then for Black, you can see that if you're previously classified as white, and the likelihood of being classified as Black is 1.3%, and then 98.2% if you're currently Black to being classified, or if you were classified as Black in previous year's race, that you'd be classified as Black in this year's interview. And you can see that this difference is the same for both men and women. 95.8 here, 95.8 here, 1.2, 1.3 here. The point of this data just being that there's not an overall difference between gender, and that there is misclassification of race. Obviously, in the other section, there's a lot higher percentage of misclassification than in the white and the Black specifically. Okay, so for the analysis, so they use a multivariate logistical regression, and I just want to cover quickly why they would use logistic instead of linear. So the results of these independent variables being measured are categories, right? So has the individual ever been below the poverty line, yes or no? So that means that you're going to get either, this is a probability frame on the one side, so you're either going to get for each individual data point a 0 or a 1, right? So here, this is if 70% of the respondents said no and 30% of the respondents said yes, you're going to get a data point on this line at a 0.3 probability. So for categorical variables, you want to use a logistic regression, not a linear, because of this sort of behavior of the probabilities, right? And then additionally, the output of this is going to give you an odds ratio, which is going to tell you the likelihood between the counterfactual and the factual scenario, which means that greater than 1 is more likely to happen after treatment, and less than 1 is less likely to happen after treatment. So that's just a brief overview of how logistic regression works and why the authors are choosing to use that in the study. Okay, so here's the majority of the results are listed in this table, Table 3, and what Table 3 shows is the results of the multivariate logistical analysis, where they take each status marker and then compare it to the so they get the net result, which is compared to if you're holding all of the other variables listed here constant, and then determining if there's any specific net effect of that status marker. So if we look at ever long-term employed, and we get for classified as white, for women, there's a 0.71 odd ratio, meaning that there is a 29% reduction in the likelihood of being classified as white if you've ever been long-term unemployed and are a woman. These 3 stars right here indicate significance. So 3 stars is 0.001, and you can see here that this is true for both women and men. And then that's what this third column here measures, is the difference in these 2 coefficients and whether or not that difference is significant. So we see that for this one, we have a 0.062, which is outside the margin of significance, which is 0.05. So for some values, you'll see like ever below the poverty line is a significant p-value between men and women, meaning that if you're a woman who's below the poverty line, you're more likely to be classified as white than a man who's below the poverty line. And that corresponds, they argue, with how we see men as the like caretakers of the home, or the primary income receivers, and so that aligns with the stereotypical assessment of how people are classified. And we can look over here. For this case, we see kind of the opposite as classified as black. You're more likely to be classified as black if you've ever been below the poverty line for both women and men. And that's kind of the crux of what this experiment is trying to demonstrate, is that for a specific status marker, you can have different effects for women and men, and you can have different effects for if an individual is likely to be classified as white or an individual is likely to be classified as black. One important characteristic of this study is if you look here at same race previously, this is one of the variables that's being controlled against. So this data is not saying that for every individual in the study, there's a higher likelihood of being classified as white if you've ever been below the poverty line. It's being controlled against the same race previously, so it's saying even when accounting for this 160-fold odds ratio, so 160 times more likely to be classified as white if you were previously classified as white, even when controlling for that, there's a likelihood of, or there's a significant effect on the probability that you'll ever be, that if you've ever been below the poverty line, you'll be classified as white. And you can look through here and see a number of examples of significant values that are significant for between women and men. So if we look here, education in years is significant between men and women, meaning if you're a woman who has more education, you're more likely to be classified as black than if you're a male who has more education. Some additional ones we can see here, that in the same race previously, you're less likely to be classified as a black woman, since it's the same race previously, than you are to be classified as a black man, which the authors say means that being a black male is more sticky, so that it's harder to change perceptions on black males. Okay, if we go, this is just a continuation of the table that shows the footnote and the classification of the stars and the p-values. I just wanted to note here that I think that authors should not break up their data onto multiple pages and should instead format it so that you can read it in one page, even if that's like a 2-column situation, or breaking these up into controls and test variables. Either of those would probably be better than this situation where this image is on one page and then continues on to the next page. So, and this is the only figure they provide, but it's just to demonstrate that they basically come up with 3 types of status marker responses. So for some status distinctions, they're gender neutral, but they still affect racial classification significantly. And you can see this is the reduction from 1 in terms of the odds ratio. So we see here between men and women, there's no difference, but there's still a significant response in terms of the odds ratio going down. And then some status distinctions affect men and women differently with different magnitudes, but are still racially are still significant for race classification, and that's what you can see in this one. There's a difference in magnitude, and this is for the status marker poverty, but they're both still significant. And then the third kind of response is situations where it's significant for one gender and not significant for the other, and also in terms of race, and then also with a discrepancy in terms of gender. So you can see that for men ever experiencing welfare, there's an insignificant difference between between one and that variable, but for women, there is a significant difference in terms of misclassifying their race. Okay, so the conclusions, the results are consistent with expectations of how common racial stereotypes are linked with gender and class, meaning for the status attributes that we thought or that one would think would be stereotyped against, the results correspond as one would expect. It's also interesting to note how common over a 20-year period one's race perception will change. This data is not included in the study, but discussed in the paper. It says, so for 14% of individuals who are Black will be classified as white over the course of a 20-year period, and then 5% of individuals from white to Black. And then you couple this with the results of the experiment, and it's easy to see how data about a person changes with how people perceive them based on social factors. So that's what this one says. Race perception can change based on social status factors. And then before discrimination can occur, discriminators must racially categorize their targets using data about their social status and gender. So that makes this study worthwhile for me because it helps establish how important personal data and the context in which it is given determines the likelihood that someone is discriminated against. And then changing stereotypical categorization is difficult. The study demonstrates that behavior that does not align with stereotypes does not effectively change those stereotypes. For example, Black women who do not receive welfare benefits does not change the narrative that Black women take advantage of welfare benefits. Instead, those who oppose the categorization are simply recategorized into what aligns with the typical prejudice. So Black women who do not receive welfare benefits are just being seen as more white, basically. That's all I have. Thank you for listening.